Hello, this is Pastor Mike in Southern Oregon. This is another recording and video from the Remnant Church here in Southern Oregon. And what we're going to talk about today, it's kind of a follow-up on other videos that we've done. It's going to be entitled State Override City. Today's date is March 21st, 2020, and the number assigned to this video will be 2020 V for video 007. I'm going to start right in and jump into the disclaimer, and then we're going to explain what this is about. The information provided herein is for educational, truth, and knowledge purposes only. No specific course of action is directed except the advancement of knowledge and truth. The following understanding, opinion, analysis is based upon the legal and related issues in the United States of America. For those who live outside the USA, you should consult the laws in your own country or consult with legal counsel. For those within the USA, if you conclude that my understanding, opinions, and analysis of the legal and related issues to be unacceptable or incorrect, you should do your own research, read the cases yourself, come to your own understanding and conclusions, or consult with legal counsel of your choice. As always, I, Pastor Mike Benjamins Jr., hereinafter referred to as Pastor Mike, address the various issues as a pastor of God in my ecclesiastical office and capacity, primarily but not exclusively to keep believers in God as well as others aware of their various rights, freedom, and liberty under God or man, and relative to their relationship with the various laws of man. No specific course of action is directed or implied, and the believer or non-believer should rely upon their own understanding, judgment, and conclusions upon which to base any acts or omissions for which they are solely responsible and are undertaken at their own risk, peril, and liability. Pastor Mike disclaims all liability and responsibility for the implementation of the understanding, opinions, or analyses set forth herein. The Remnant Church in Southern Oregon, as well as Pastor Mike, in both his personal and ecclesiastical capacities, including his subordinates and personnel, individually and jointly, disclaim any and all liability and responsibility for any damages sustained or suffered by the readers, viewers, or other entities in the implementation of the teachings set forth in this video or treatise. I reiterate, the material is provided as a research study project for learning purposes only, and any implementations or applications are undertaken at the sole risk and peril of such readers, viewers, and entities. No statement is made or implied as to the ultimate outcome resulting from such implementations or applications. Therefore, I hereby declare, claim, and assert on behalf of the Remnant Church, its pastors and personnel, individually and jointly, any and all legal and religious protections of whatsoever nature and kind, including protection from discrimination on the basis of religion, available under the inherent, inalienable, primary, and subordinate rights and laws. Okay, we did a video previously, which was numbered 2020 V004. That was on February 22nd, 2020, called Second Amendment Limitations. There we addressed, if you haven't seen it yet, it'd be well worth your trouble to go look at it. There we talk about the limitations of the Second Amendment and how you can use another legal strategy to get to your inherent and inalienable rights. Then thereafter we did a video on March 7th, 2020, and it is numbered 2020 V005 on sanctuary counties and cities. And this, what we're going to talk about today, we're going to try to make this a short video. We're going to talk about today kind of fits into these other teachings. So with that, I'm going to turn this over to my son. He's going to explain real quickly what this talk is going to be about.
Good evening. On or about March 13th of 2020, the mayor of Champaign, Illinois, issued an executive order, and immediately following that, or rapidly following that, the city officials passed a unanimous resolution to halt the sale of guns, gasoline, alcohol, and impose curfews. Then yesterday, March 20th, 2020, the Illinois Governor J.B. Pritzker, I think I'm saying that right,
Yeah.
he's a liberal Democrat, typically anti-gun, issued an executive order for a statewide shutdown of Illinois. But he exempted gun and ammo stores and sales, labeling them as essential for safety and security.
Okay, now is this in reaction to the coronavirus situation? Is that what this is all in reaction to?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. So they're saying there's some kind of an emergency situation, and as a result, they want to stop non-essential sales. Is that? Am I
Yeah,
that
most
right?
states are imposing the same idea, yeah, at varying degrees.
And the city mayor, and then later on the other city officials decided that guns and ammo were both non-essential.
I'm not sure if ammunition was included, but they were wanting to close all gun stores, which is where ammunition was sold.
Okay.
So
Basically a shutdown on the buying of guns.
yes.
Okay, so we don't know about the ammunition part of it at this point.
No, but in Illinois, like I say, it's not exactly like it is, everywhere else. So the gun stores are the ones that sell the ammunition there as well. So they have
Okay.
tighter restrictions there on sales compared to some places.
Okay, would you say it was unusual for this governor to do this, in your opinion?
In my opinion, I'm very, very surprised that this
Yeah.
Democratic liberal governor did this.
Okay, so basically the governor said, no, you can't do that to the city.
Yeah. His as governor of the state, his executive order would override any
Yeah.
resolutions they passed.
So he considers the gun stores to remain open as an essential thing.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. All right.
Thank you.
All right. Okay. For those who have seen my previous video on sanctuary counties and cities, you then know, and I'm going to do a quick review of that so that you kind of understand what's happening there. I explained in that video, by the way, if you get a chance, take a look at that video as well. It's on YouTube at my Real Life Changing Truth channel. And I also have it, if you scroll down through my Facebook sites, you'll find it there as well, because we did post it. Well, there's a link to YouTube there on my sites. One of the main sites that you can go to would be Pastor Mike's Advanced Studies in Truth group on Facebook, and you should find it there if you scroll down. Now there I explained that sovereignty trumps sovereignty. Now I also explained that counties are not sovereign. Counties are subdivisions within the sovereign state. Cities are also subdivisions, or governmental subdivisions within the sovereign state. And they're, of course, municipal corporations. By and large, they're all municipal corporations. Okay, so therefore, neither does a county have sovereignty, nor does a city have sovereignty. And it doesn't really matter how big, some of the cities in the United States are pretty big, like Los Angeles, Chicago, New York. The big cities, they're big bureaucratic governmental units. That doesn't mean that they're sovereign, though. Even though they may be big and have big budgets and have a lot of employees, it doesn't make them sovereign. Now, in our system of government, the states are sovereign. They hold sovereignty. The federal government holds sovereignty. Now, you may well ask, you would say, well, how do we, also let me explain one other thing. Because of the of the 1793 case of Chisholm versus Georgia, Justice John Jay said that at the revolution, at the conclusion of the revolution, the sovereignty devolved onto the people, which means that the people are sovereign as well. Now, the sovereignty starts with the people. The people created the government and local government initially, villages and things like that way back. But anyway, the point is the state did not create itself. It comes from somewhere. The state actually uses the sovereignty that comes from the people to have sovereignty at the state level. The federal government was created by the people and the states, and that's where they got their sovereignty. So they're sovereign, they hold sovereign status at the federal level and the state level, and the people hold sovereignty. So it all back engineers back onto the people. Now, let me throw one thing in so that maybe it'll help you a little bit. How can you tell whether a governmental unit is sovereign? One of the sure ways that you can tell is by the fact that they are able to pass laws and impose the death penalty. You can't do that at the city level. You can't do that at the county level. But the state, being sovereign, can do that. They can impose the death penalty. At the federal level, they can impose the death penalty and pass capital laws, which carry capital punishment. Now, there's a side sovereignty that exists, and that would be military sovereignty. It is a lesser and subordinate sovereignty than federal sovereignty, but it is yet sovereignty. The federal government allows for the military to be able to execute people that need to be executed. They also have the power to impose the death penalty at the military level. That tells you something. That tells you that they have been given enough sovereignty to be able to do that. So if you see that happening, you know sovereignty is at work. If it can't happen at the lower levels, you know sovereignty is not at work. That's the way it goes. Now, there is another, I'll explain this. I hope it doesn't upset anybody, but I will explain it very quickly. We speak of the Indian tribes. And I actually have a book on Indian tribal, Indian law. And they have reservations and this and that. Now, they speak in those books about a type of sovereignty held by the tribes. But it's not the same kind of sovereignty as the state and the federal government and the military holds. It is sovereign in name, yes. Do they actually hold the actual sovereign powers that a sovereign power would hold? Well, in terms of they can pass some tribal laws and issue traffic tickets and make minor, they can address minor issues less than a felony. They can address that. When it gets up to the higher criminal issues, it's not handled at their level. It's handled at the federal level. And so you can see, even though the word sovereignty may be used, that doesn't mean that they're able to exercise full sovereignty or even sufficient sovereignty to be really looked at as a sovereign entity. Yes, I would call it a species of sovereignty that is actually under the control of the federal government.
The same kind of like the cities and counties do under the state.
The difference is we don't call counties sovereign and we don't call cities sovereign, but the tribes are spoken of as being as holding some form of sovereignty.
But it's only sort of quasi.
I would say it's quasi, and perhaps even in name only. Like I said, I don't want to offend anybody. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on it. I just wanted you to know how you can tell when a governmental unit it actually holds sovereignty. And that's one of the sure ways to tell that I just explained to you. Okay, now, since the city of Champaign, you said?
Champaign.
Yeah, in Illinois, went ahead and issued an executive order basically saying you can't buy guns. And of course, that would be an infringement of not only the private sector being able to sell the guns and run their business, but it would be, in effect, a roundabout way of infringing on the rights of the people to keep and bear arms. So it's a problem for them to do that at their level. Now, I'm not saying they can't do it. Certainly a mayor can issue an executive order. Certainly, city officials can pass a resolution. That does not mean that they can't be overridden by the sovereign power of the state, and that's exactly what happened here. And I wanted you to understand how this really works. I mean, a city cannot just go ahead and say, well, we don't care what the state says. We're just going to go ahead and close all the gun shops and say people can't buy guns and indirectly infringe the rights of the people to keep and bear arms. Now, this has already tried to happen in other places, where Chicago comes to mind. That's one place. The McDonald decision is a clear showing that the city was in effect infringing upon the rights of the inherent and inalienable rights of the people to protect themselves through the keeping and bearing of arms. And in the case in the McDonald case, the Supreme Court said, no, you can't do that, because you're taking the rights of the people away to be able to have a handgun for self-protection. And
they created a de facto state of no right to bear arms.
Exactly, a roundabout way of doing it, a backdoor way.
Yeah.
So I know it's happened before, and this can I'll tell you something else that can really, really confuse people. Sometimes the sovereign state sits back and says, one of our cities passed a law. It depends what they're thinking at the time, but one of our cities passed a law, and we know that we can override it, but maybe we're not going to right away. Maybe we're just going to sit back and see what happens. And they'll just sit back and see just exactly how this plays out. And that will confuse people. They'll think, oh, the county or the city has the power to do this because nobody did anything. No. Just because the schoolyard bully doesn't beat you up doesn't mean he couldn't. You see, we have to understand that. He just decided not to beat you up today or the next day or the next day, and then on the fourth or fifth day he might decide to beat you up. So don't make the mistake of thinking that when the sovereign power of the state doesn't act immediately, that means that what they did at the lower levels is legitimate and can't be challenged. That's not true. And why people would play such games, that's whatever's in their mind. They do it for their own reasons. As far as the right to keep and bear arms goes, I'm going to talk about that for a little bit. Be aware, and I'll mention it again in this video, that the right of self-protection, which is of course interconnected with the right to life, and the right to keep and bear, I always use the word adequate arms. If you want to know why I do that, you have to look at some of my other videos. But anyway, adequate arms. Now, of course, one of the ways that you can make a backdoor nullification of your right to keep and bear arms would be if they just outlawed the sale of ammunition. They can do that, They can say, we're going to let you keep your guns, but we're not going to sell you any more ammunition. And when you run out, you just run out. Which is a roundabout way of nullifying your right to keep and bear arms, because without bullets, what good is, well, you can use it for a paperweight or something, but other than that, or you could put it in a glass case to look at, but it won't fire without ammunition. So unless you're able to make your own ammunition, you're going to be without ammunition to use in your firearm. So there are all kinds of different ways to infringe upon the rights of the people. Now, what I wanted to say, I'm getting long-winded here, but what I wanted to say was this. Your right to keep and bear arms, and your right to life, and your right to self-protection is an inherent and inalienable right which pre-exists the federal government and the states, and for that matter, it pre-exists the political system itself. That's why Justice Scalia, the late Justice Scalia, called them pre-political rights. He said it pre-exists the political system, which means that the Second Amendment did not grant you these rights. You already had them. The only thing that the Second Amendment does is to stop the government, or initially only the federal government, because initially the Second Amendment and the Bill of Rights only applied to the federal government, stops them from infringing those inherent and inalienable rights that you already had. At the McDonald decision in 2010, McDonald versus Chicago, they then applied it through a process called selective incorporation of the Bill of Rights upon the states. They then applied the Second Amendment to the states. It didn't happen until 2010, which is quite a revelation for some people, because they weren't aware that from 1791 until 2010, the Second Amendment didn't apply to the states. And if you want to know more about that, you need to watch my Second Amendment limitations video. It's quite important to take a look at that one. So what it means is that when we say Second Amendment rights, it doesn't mean that these rights, the right to keep and bear arms, flows from the Second Amendment. If there is such a thing as a Second Amendment right, it is the right not to have the government infringe upon your inherent and inalienable right to keep and bear arms that you already had. Okay, is there anything else that you think that we need to address? It pretty much covers it, isn't it? I wanted you to understand what was happening here. It kind of confirms what I said before, that the sovereign state can override a county or a city. So in other words, there we had spoken of Second Amendment sanctuary counties, where they said, well, in our county here, we're going to pass an ordinance or a piece of legislation that says that the Second Amendment will be respected and it will not be infringed within our county. That's okay. They can go ahead and pass an ordinance like that, but it doesn't mean that it can't be overridden by the sovereign state, because they don't have sovereignty. They can't do it independent of or completely isolated from what the state may do. As far as in San Francisco, they were toying with sanctuary cities rather, for immigration purposes.
Many cities have done that.
Yeah, they're not the only city that have done that. The other cities have done that as well, and pretty much there you're dealing with the federal government. The federal government is the sovereign there, and of course they have the power as a sovereign to say, well, we are going to make the final decision on immigration issues. And the city of San Francisco or other cities can't really do that. Yeah.
In the case of immigration, there are states, including ours here in Oregon, who have tried to turn it into a sanctuary state. Now, could you address that briefly, that between the state is a sovereign, trying to create a sanctuary state, versus the federal government and their authority to deal with immigration?
Yeah, I can address that. Okay, that's an interesting point, because the state is sovereign, and the federal government is sovereign, and the people are sovereign. Okay, if the state were to declare a sanctuary state, that of course would have more weight than a county or city doing it. However, here's the problem there, which means that the state would be testing out whether or not they could run this by without any interference from the federal government. Basically, state sovereignty trying to trump federal sovereignty. Okay. Well, here's the problem. When the states created the federal government and got together and did that, they agreed to certain things under the Constitutional Compact. Now, when you do that, the states gave up or surrendered or acquiesced some of their sovereignty to the federal government. It was limited, though. It's spelled out in the Constitution, the powers that were granted to the federal government. So it's not unlimited power. that is a factor which has to be looked at when a state tries to say, we're not going to, let's say the federal government, just use a hypothetical situation. Let's say the federal government were to say, we're going to seize everybody's guns. And then one of the states, or two of the states, or whatever, two states say, no, we're not going to comply to that. We're going to make whatever state a sanctuary state where you can't, where your federal ruling or law that you made or legislation can't function, can't operate. That's a problem. That's a problem. They may not be able to sustain that because of what I just explained to you. Now, there's another problem with that, and that is this. The Constitution clearly sets out what the powers of the federal government are and what powers they were granted. And they're not supposed to go beyond those powers. Now, there are those who would argue that if the Constitution doesn't specifically prohibit it, they can do it. Whatever the Constitution doesn't specifically prohibit is open and fair game for them. They
Despite
can go.
the fact that the language was clearly the other direction.
It's the other direction, but never mind that. Let's say that there are people argue that.
Yeah.
Okay, that's of course incorrect. That's not how it works. As a matter of fact, it's quite the opposite. In the 9th and 10th Amendments, it clearly spells out that any powers that are not specifically spoken of in the Constitution, and those are reserved to the people and the states. So it's the other way around. However, it might not, even though the states are sovereign and the federal government is sovereign in that hypothetical example I gave you, does not mean that the state's going to be able to pull this off. If some smart lawyers said, well, look, you granted certain powers to us, you have, I would do it this way. If I was a prosecutor for the federal government, I would say, well, now such and such a state, you do have senators, state senators, in our Congress, right? Yeah. You do have state representatives in our Congress, right? Yeah. So you do have a say. You do have a say what the federal government does and doesn't do, because you have these representatives from your state up here in Washington. Yeah. Okay. Well, I'd start there. I'd start there and say, now it isn't like the federal government just does this without you having state people up there. You do have state people up there. So you're getting a say. That would also be under some concept of due process. You see, you are being heard. You're getting due process up here. Yeah.
Does the Constitution specifically say whether or not immigration from out of the country is primarily the purview of the state or the federal government? Does it?
It's the federal government.
It does. Okay.
Yeah. Because when the states got together and became a uniting of states and became then a nation, the object there, of course, is to control who can immigrate into the nation. And that would be a national issue, not just a state issue. This is one of the powers that the states granted to the federal government, and for them to oversee. And I don't see any problem with a nation having say in who gets to come into the nation. I think that's reasonable, and I think it's proper. So therefore, there are powers that we have given to the national government that they should have. I hope that's enough to explain, how some of this fits together. Like I said, I don't want to make this video too long. The problem is, to be honest, I can probably rattle on for 2 hours about all this, but I'm not going to do it. I just want you to get the idea that this is what happened in the state of Illinois. A city tried to say that we're going to close down these gun shops and shut down the sales, and they're saying it was essential because of this coronavirus emergency. You see, we got to shut this down. Well, the exact opposite is true. When you have an emergency situation in which there is danger and there is the possibility of an upsurge in crime, then that's not the time to limit or infringe on the rights of the people to protect themselves. The very opposite is true, and the state governor here in Illinois confirmed that and said, look, I'm going to call this an essential thing. The people need to be able to protect themselves during an emergency situation. Now, I'll close with this so that you get a good idea of this. During times of war and during emergency times, one of the first things that tries to happen is to set aside the law, the regular law, and put in place of the regular law emergency measures and laws. Because the argument being that the regular laws can't operate.
So some of it may be reasonable.
Some of it is indeed reasonable. However, it cannot be allowed to become a superhighway to the loss of all your rights.
Being exploited.
Yeah, being exploited. And let me say this. If there are emergency measures in place which set aside the law, as in the case of martial law, setting aside regular law for a time during some kind of an emergency, when the emergency's over, you get your rights back. Otherwise, you might end up in some argument of a continuing state of emergency that never ends. It never ends. And therefore, you never get your rights back. A continuous state of emergency. That's not what we want. We're a free people. We have rights. We have inherent and inalienable rights. And if for some legitimate reason those rights have to be in whole or part, incrementally or all at once, set aside, legitimately set aside, when the emergency is over, you get your rights back. Or as soon as it's reasonably not severe enough an emergency that those rights should be withheld from the people. That's an important point, and we need to all be aware of it. We need to all be aware of it. But in this particular case, when this information came to me, my son and I were both, surprised that the state governor said, nope, that's an essential function, even during an emergency like this coronavirus, and the people, we're not going to allow the city to go shutting down the gun stores. So with that, this is Pastor Mike saying, until our next video, God bless.